Captain Jake Morrison stared at the golden invitation in his hand and wondered how his day had gone so wrong. The shimmering letters seemed to dance across the metallic surface, spelling out words in a language he barely understood. Something about a royal wedding on the crystal moon of Silverhaven and his presence being required immediately. The problem was simple yet complicated at the same time. This invitation was meant for Ambassador Collins, who currently lay in the medical bay with a terrible case of Rigelian flu. The diplomatic corps had panicked and shoved the invitation into his hands with barely any explanation. Now Jake stood in the docking bay of his ship wearing his dress uniform and wondering what he had gotten himself into. The shuttle ride to Silverhaven took 3 hours, and Jake spent every minute reading the briefing materials. The Elven Confederation was one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in this sector of space. They looked almost human but lived for thousands of years, and possessed technology that seemed like magic. Their Princess Ilara Moonwhisper was getting married to some prince from a neighboring system, and Earth needed to maintain good relations. When the shuttle landed, Jake stepped out onto a platform made of crystal that reflected 1,000 colors. The palace rose before him like something from a fantasy tale, with towers that spiraled up into the purple sky. Elven guards stood at attention, wearing armor that gleamed like starlight and carrying weapons that hummed with energy. A tall elf with silver hair and golden robes approached him and bowed slightly. He spoke in perfect English and welcomed Jake to the ceremony. The elf, whose name was Counselor Venn, led him through corridors filled with other guests from dozens of different species. Jake saw beings made of pure light, others covered in scales and some that floated without touching the ground. The ceremony hall was enormous, with a ceiling so high Jake could barely see it. Thousands of guests filled the seats, and at the far end sat 2 thrones. On the larger throne sat King Theron, who wore a crown of living flames. On the smaller throne sat Princess Ilara, and Jake felt his breath catch when he saw her. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost unreal, with silver hair that flowed down her back like liquid moonlight, and eyes that glowed with a soft blue light. She wore a dress of white and gold that seemed to shift and change as she moved. But what caught his attention most was the massive creature that lay beside her throne. The dragon was enormous, with scales the color of burning coals and eyes like molten gold. Its wings were folded against its body, but Jake could tell they would span the entire hall if opened. The creature watched the crowd with an intelligence that made Jake uncomfortable, as if it could see into his very soul. The ceremony began with music that sounded like crystal bells and starlight. The groom, Prince Mordain, walked down the aisle looking proud and arrogant in his dark robes. He had sharp features and cold eyes that barely glanced at the crowd. When he reached the throne, he bowed to the king, but not to the princess. Jake found himself seated near the front, much closer than he expected. An elf servant placed a tray of drinks beside him, and Jake gratefully took one. The golden liquid inside looked like champagne, and he drank it quickly, hoping it would calm his nerves. The king stood and raised his hands for silence. He spoke in the Elven language, but translators whispered the words in English. He talked about ancient traditions and the binding of 2 houses through marriage. Then he said something that made Jake freeze. The trial of worthiness was an old custom where any guest could challenge the groom for the right to marry the princess. It required drinking from the ceremonial chalice and declaring the challenge. Jake looked down at the empty cup in his hand and felt his stomach drop. The golden cup he had drunk from was not champagne for guests. It was the ceremonial chalice. Every eye in the hall turned to look at him, and he heard gasps and whispers. The king stared at him with surprise, while Princess Ilara leaned forward with interest. Prince Mordain looked furious. Jake wanted to explain that it was a mistake, but the words would not come. Counselor Venn approached him quickly and whispered that he must now complete the challenge or insult the entire Elven Confederation. There was no way out. Jake had accidentally entered a trial that would determine who married the princess. The king declared that the trial would be one of wit and wisdom rather than combat. 3 riddles would be asked, and whoever answered correctly would win. Jake felt slightly relieved until he saw Mordain smiling. The prince clearly thought this would be easy. The first riddle was about elven history, and Mordain answered it perfectly. The second riddle was about ancient magic, and again Mordain knew the answer. Jake had no idea what either riddle even meant, and he started to sweat. The third riddle would decide everything. The king spoke slowly and clearly. He asked a riddle about what binds all living things together across all worlds and all species. Mordain began to answer something about cosmic energy or ancient bloodlines, but Jake suddenly knew the answer. He stood up and spoke clearly, saying that it was stories and memories. Every species tells stories about their heroes and their past, and those stories connect everyone together across time and space. Even beings that never meet share the same need to remember and to dream. The hall fell silent, and then the king began to laugh. It was a warm, genuine laugh that echoed through the chamber. He declared that Jake had answered correctly with wisdom that came from the heart rather than books. Prince Mordain had given the answer of a scholar, but Jake had given the answer of someone who understood life. By ancient law, Jake was now engaged to Princess Alara. Mordain shouted in anger and stormed out of the hall. The dragon lifted its head and made a sound that might have been amusement. Princess Alara stood and walked toward Jake with slow, graceful steps. She stopped in front of him and looked into his eyes. Her expression was unreadable, but Jake saw something there that might have been curiosity or perhaps respect. She spoke in a voice like music and said that fate worked in mysterious ways. Then she returned to her throne, leaving Jake standing alone and confused. The king declared that Jake would have 3 months to prove himself worthy of marrying his daughter. During that time, he would live in the palace and learn the ways of the Elven Confederation. If he succeeded, they would marry, and he would become part of the royal family. If he failed, he would return to Earth with honor. Jake wanted to protest that this was all a mistake, but he saw the hope in the eyes of the other humans present. They needed this alliance, and he had accidentally become the key to making it work. He bowed to the king and accepted his fate. As guards led him to his new quarters, Jake looked back one more time at the princess and her dragon. Alara was watching him with those glowing eyes, and for the first time in years, Jake felt like his life was about to become very interesting. Jake woke up in a bed that felt like sleeping on clouds, and for a moment he forgot where he was. Then he remembered the wedding and the challenge, and the fact that he was now engaged to an alien princess. He groaned and pulled a pillow over his face. Someone knocked on his door, and Jake called out for them to enter. An elf servant brought in breakfast that looked like nothing he had ever seen before. There were fruits that glowed softly and bread that smelled like honey and starlight. The servant bowed and told him that Princess Alara requested his presence in the training courtyard. Jake dressed quickly in the clothes that had been left for him and followed a guard through the palace. The training courtyard was an open space surrounded by tall walls with a floor made of smooth white stone. Princess Alara stood in the center wearing armor that looked light but strong. Beside her was the dragon. She greeted Jake without ceremony and told him that if he wanted to survive the next 3 months, he needed to understand what it meant to be her partner. The dragon, she explained, was named Emberfang and had been bonded to her since childhood. Together they fought against threats that most people never knew existed. Jake asked what kind of threats, and Alara began to explain. The Shadow Swarm was an ancient enemy that consumed entire worlds. They were parasitic beings that infected living creatures and turned them into mindless servants. The Elven Confederation had been fighting them for thousands of years. Emberfang shifted his massive body, and Jake heard a voice in his mind. It was deep and somewhat amused. Asking if the small human was frightened, Jake jumped in surprise, and Alara smiled slightly. She explained that Emberfang could speak directly into minds, but only those he chose to communicate with. The dragon seemed to be testing him, and Jake decided to answer honestly. He said yes. He was frightened, but also curious and determined not to fail. Emberfang made that rumbling sound again and said that at least the human was honest, unlike most elves who pretended to be brave. Over the following days, Alara took Jake through intense training. She taught him how to ride on Emberfang's back, which was terrifying and thrilling at the same time. The dragon would soar through the sky at incredible speeds, doing rolls and dives that left Jake breathless. Slowly, he began to understand the bond between rider and dragon. Ilara also brought him to the war councils where military leaders discussed strategies against the Shadow Swarm. Jake met Commander Kate Bradley, who was the only other human serving in the Confederation military. Kate had been here for 5 years and had earned respect through her tactical skills. Kate pulled Jake aside one day and warned him about the situation. Princess Ilara had never shown interest in anyone before, and many believed she never would. The dragon was her only true companion, and she seemed content with that. The original groom, Prince Mordain, had wanted to marry her not for love, but to gain control of Emberfang power. Jake asked why control of the dragon mattered so much, and Kate explained, dragons bonded for life to their riders, and their fire could destroy almost anything, including the Shadow Swarm. Whoever controlled Emberfang would have the most powerful weapon in the Confederation. Mordain had wanted that power for his own military ambitions. As weeks passed, Jake spent more time with Alara and began to see past her warrior exterior. She showed him the scars on her arms from the bonding ritual with Emberfang and explained that becoming a keeper meant giving up normal life. Most elves lived for thousands of years having families and peaceful lives, but keepers dedicated themselves to protecting others. One evening, they sat on a balcony, watching the stars, and Alara admitted she was tired. She had fought for 300 years without rest, and sometimes she wondered what it would be like to not carry such responsibility. Jake understood that feeling better than she knew. He told her about his own losses and how his family had died in a colony attack when he was young. He had survived because he was away at the academy, and the guilt had driven him to become a soldier. They had both chosen paths of duty over personal happiness, and that created an unexpected connection between them. Emberfang joined them on the balcony and commented that perhaps fate had been kind to bring them together. Both of them needed someone who understood the weight they carried. Jake laughed and said he had never expected wisdom from a dragon who enjoyed making sarcastic comments. The dragon replied that he was full of surprises and then offered to take them flying. They soared through the night sky over the crystal moon, and Jake felt something shift inside him. This strange new life was starting to feel less like a mistake and more like destiny. But not everything was peaceful, and Jake soon learned that Prince Mordain was spreading rumors. He claimed that Jake was a spy sent by Earth to weaken the Confederation from within. Some of the elven nobles believed these lies and began to treat Jake with suspicion and hostility. Ilara defended him publicly, but Jake knew it was causing problems. He did not want to be a burden or create divisions within her people. Kate advised him to prove his worth through actions rather than words, and Jake agreed. When news came of Shadow Swarm activity near the outer colonies, Jake immediately volunteered to join the defense fleet. Ilara tried to refuse, saying he was not ready, but Jake insisted he was a trained captain with combat experience, and Earth tactics might help against the enemy. After a long argument, Ilara agreed, but only if Jake flew alongside her and Emberfang. She would not let him go into danger alone. Jake accepted and prepared for his first real battle in this new life. The night before they departed, Ilara came to his quarters and they talked for hours. She admitted that she had never expected to care about anyone again, and it frightened her. Jake took her hand and promised he would come back safely. Emberfang's voice echoed in both their minds, saying that the human had better keep that promise or the dragon would be very annoyed. They all laughed, and Jake felt the bond between the three of them growing stronger as they prepared to launch into space. Jake looked at Ilara and her dragon and realized something important. He had come to an alien wedding by accident, but he was staying by choice. Whatever happened next, They would face it together. The battle began before Jake expected, and chaos erupted across the communication channels. Shadow Swarm bioships appeared from dark space like nightmares made real, and their living hulls pulsed with sickening light. Jake watched from his fighter as they descended on the outer colony with terrifying speed. Ilara and Emberfang launched first with the dragon-roaring flames that lit up the darkness. Kate commanded a squadron of human fighters, and her tactical voice cut through the panic. Jake joined the formation and immediately saw how different this enemy was from anything he had fought before. The bioships moved like living creatures because they were living creatures. They twisted and changed shape, avoiding weapons fire and regenerating damage almost instantly. Traditional Confederation tactics were not working and ships were dying. Jake called out to Kate, suggesting they try Earth guerrilla strategies. Kate understood immediately and began issuing new orders. Instead of direct assaults, they would hit and run, striking weak points and retreating before the enemy could adapt. The human fighters broke formation and scattered, making themselves harder to target while still doing damage. Ilara noticed the change and demanded to know what they were doing. Jake explained quickly and asked her to trust him. She hesitated for only a moment before agreeing and ordering the elven fighters to follow the human tactics. Emberfang seemed amused by the chaos. The new strategy worked better than expected, and the Shadow Swarm ships began to fall back. But then sensors detected something massive approaching from deeper in dark space. A flagship appeared that dwarfed all the other bioships, and its presence made Jake sick just looking at it. The flagship targeted Ilara and Emberfang specifically, as if it knew they were the greatest threat. Energy beams that looked like diseased light shot toward them, and Ilara tried to dodge, but there were too many. Jake saw what was about to happen and made a decision. He pushed his fighter to maximum speed and rammed directly into the flagship targeting systems. The impact was devastating, and alarms screamed as his ship tore apart. Jake hit the ejection button, and his pod shot away from the explosion. The flagship staggered, and Emberfang took advantage, launching a torrent of dragonfire into its core. The bioship screamed with a sound that hurt to hear and began to break apart. Jake felt relief for about 2 seconds before something wrapped around his ejection pod. A tendril from the dying flagship had grabbed him and was pulling him inside. Jake fought against it, but the biomaterial was too strong. He heard Ilara screaming his name and Emberfang roaring, but they were too far away. The darkness swallowed him whole. Jake woke in a nightmare made real, surrounded by pulsing walls of living tissue. The air smelled like decay and something sweet that made him want to vomit. He was trapped in some kind of bio-prison deep inside what remained of the flagship. The Shadow Swarm hive mind touched his thoughts, and Jake felt violation like nothing he had experienced. It wanted information about Earth and its location. The parasite intelligence was ancient and hungry and patient. It pressed against his mind, trying to break through his defenses. Jake knew he could not let it win, and he began to fight back using every mental trick he had learned. He fed the hive mind false information and corrupted data while protecting the real coordinates of Earth. The battle happened in seconds, but felt like hours. Then Jake discovered something crucial while defending his mind. The hive mind feared fire, and specifically the ancient dragon fire that Emberfang possessed. That fire was not normal flame, but something older and more primal that could destroy the Shadow Swarm permanently. Jake held on to that information, knowing it might be the key to winning the war. He just needed to survive long enough to share it. The bio-prison kept him alive because the hive mind was not done with him yet, but Jake refused to break. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Ilara was losing control in a way she never had before. She screamed orders that made no sense, and Emberfang felt her anguish through their bond. The dragon tried to comfort her, but nothing worked. Kate had to physically grab her and shake her to get her attention. For the first time in 300 years, Princess Ilara Moonwhisper cried, and the tears fell like liquid starlight. She admitted to Kate that she had bonded with Jake in a way she never expected, and losing him felt like losing part of herself. Kate told her firmly that Jake was still alive and they would rescue him. Emberfang confirmed it, saying he could sense the human faintly through the strange connection they had been building. Jake was alive, but in terrible danger, and they needed to act quickly. King Theron arrived with reinforcements, and Kate explained the situation. The king looked at his daughter crying and made a decision. He authorized a rescue mission deep into Shadow Swarm territory, knowing it was dangerous, but necessary. Ilara stopped crying immediately, and her warrior mask returned. She began planning the assault with Kate, and every detail mattered. They would use a stealth approach with human ships that the swarm had not encountered much. Kate would command the fighter screen while Ilara and Emberfang went directly for the bioprison. It was risky, but Jake had saved her life and she would do the same for him. The mission launched within hours, and they traveled through dark space following the faint signal from Jake's location. The Shadow Swarm territory was horrifying, with entire planets consumed and converted into biomatter. Ilara felt rage building inside her at the destruction. When they found the prison ship, Kate fighters engaged the defenders while Ilara and Emberfang dove straight through. The dragon fire burned through biocorridors, and Ilara fought with a fury that shocked even the veterans. Nothing would stop her from reaching Jake. She found him in a chamber surrounded by tendrils and barely conscious. Ilara cut through the biomaterial with her energy blade and caught Jake as he fell. He looked at her and smiled weakly, saying he knew she would come. But Jake was infected with Shadow Swarm parasites that were slowly consuming him from inside. Ilara felt panic rise again as she realized they might be too late. Emberfang landed beside them and examined Jake with his ancient eyes. The dragon said there was only one cure, and it was dangerous. Phoenix tears or dragon fire blood could burn out the infection, but it required a willing bond between dragon and recipient. The process would change Jake forever and might kill him. Jake, barely conscious, told them to do it because he had important information about the swarm weakness. Ilara held him, while Emberfang bit his own tongue and let drops of glowing blood fall into Jake's mouth. The fire blood burned through Jake's system, destroying the parasites, but also changing him. Silver veins appeared under Jake's skin, and his eyes began to glow faintly. He screamed in pain, but Ilara held him through it. Whispering that he was strong enough to survive, Emberfang poured his will into Jake, giving him strength to endure the transformation. When it ended, Jake lay gasping but alive and free of infection. The silver veins remained as permanent marks of the dragon bond. More importantly, Jake could now sense Emberfang emotions and speak to the dragon telepathically. The three of them were truly connected now. Kate's voice crackled over the communication, demanding they leave immediately because more swarm ships were coming. Ilara helped Jake to his feet, and they ran back to the extraction point. Emberfang carried them both on his back, and they burst out of the bioship in an explosion of dragon fire. The flight back to Silverhaven felt like it took forever, but they finally made it to safety. Jake was taken to Medical Bay, where healers examined his transformation with concern and fascination. Ilara refused to leave his side, and Emberfang stood guard outside. But their problems were not over, because when they returned to the palace, they discovered something terrible had happened. Prince Mordain had staged a coup and seized control of the capital. King Theron was imprisoned, and Mordain declared himself regent. The prince announced that Ilara must marry him or watch her father die, and Kate barely escaped with her human squadron. They regrouped with Ilara and Jake in the wilderness and realized they were now fugitives hunted by their own people. Jake recovered enough to stand, and he told them what he learned about the swarm weakness to dragonfire. That information might win the war, but first they had to defeat Mordain and rescue the king. Ilara looked at Jake and Emberfang and smiled grimly. She said they had faced impossible odds before and won. This time would be no different. They would take back the throne and stop Mordain. Even if it meant fighting their own people, Jake agreed, and felt the silver veins in his skin pulse with power. The wilderness of Silverhaven was beautiful and deadly, with crystal forests that could cut through armor and storms that appeared without warning. Jake and his small group of rebels hid in ancient caves that Alara remembered from childhood. Kate worked constantly to coordinate with loyal forces still in the capital. Emberfang scouted from the air, reporting that Mordain had consolidated power quickly and many nobles supported him out of fear. The prince claimed that Alara had been corrupted by human influence and that Jake was a spy. Half the population believed these lies. Jake felt guilty knowing his presence had caused this conflict, but Alara told him firmly that Mordain would have found another excuse. The prince wanted power and had been planning this coup for years. Jake's accidental challenge had simply forced him to act sooner. They needed a plan, and Jake spent hours working with Kate and Alara to devise one. Mordain was planning a coronation ceremony in 3 days, where he would officially become king. That ceremony was their best chance to strike, because all of Mordain's forces would be gathered in one place. The plan was risky and involved infiltrating the palace during the ceremony. They would expose Mordain's alliance with corrupted dark elves who had been secretly aiding the Shadow Swarm. Kate had discovered evidence of this betrayal, but they needed to present it publicly. Alara knew secret passages in the palace from her childhood, and they would use those to get inside. Kate and the human squadron would create a diversion. While Jake and Alara rescued King Theron, Emberfang would provide aerial support and be ready to extract them if things went wrong. The night before the mission, Jake could not sleep, and he found Alara sitting alone outside the cave. She looked at him and asked if he was afraid, and Jake admitted he was terrified. She smiled and said that was good because it meant he understood the danger. They talked about what would happen if they failed, and Alara made Jake promise something important. If she died, he had to take Emberfang and continue the fight against the Shadow Swarm. Jake tried to refuse, but she insisted, saying the dragon had accepted him as a partner. Emberfang's voice spoke in both their minds, saying that all this talk of dying was depressing. The dragon declared that they would succeed because they had something Mordain lacked, which was trust and true bonds. Jake and Alara laughed and felt some of the tension ease. The day of the coronation arrived, and Jake dressed in stolen guard armor that barely fit. Alara wore a disguise that hid her distinctive silver hair, and they moved through the city carefully. The streets were crowded with people forced to attend the ceremony. Kate's squadron began their attack right on schedule, hitting military installations on the opposite side of the capital. Alarms blared, and Mordain forces rushed to respond, leaving the palace more vulnerable. Jake and Alara slipped inside through a maintenance tunnel. The secret passages were narrow and dark, and Jake had to crawl through sections that had partially collapsed. Alara moved with confidence even in total darkness, and Jake followed, trusting her completely. They heard voices above them as guards patrolled but remained undetected. They emerged in a storage room near the throne chamber and carefully made their way toward the prison levels. King Theron was being held in a cell surrounded by guards loyal to Mordain. Jake and Alara studied the situation and realized a direct assault would alert everyone. Jake had an idea based on his new dragon-touched abilities, and he asked Alara to trust him. He walked out into the open and let his silver veins begin to glow. The guards saw him and raised weapons, but Jake unleashed heat from his body, creating a wave that made them stagger back. Alara rushed in while they were disoriented, and her energy blade cut through their weapons. Within seconds, the guards were unconscious and they had the keys to the cell. King Theron looked surprised to see them, but also relieved. The king told them quickly that Mordain planned to force bond with Emberfang using ancient blood magic during the coronation. If he succeeded, Mordain would have control of the dragon and could wage war against anyone he wanted, including humanity. They had to stop the ceremony immediately, and Jake, Alara, and the king ran through the passages toward the throne room. They could hear Mordain's voice booming through speakers, declaring himself the rightful ruler of the Confederation. When they burst into the throne room, the scene was shocking and terrible. Emberfang was chained with bindings made of starlight steel, and the dragon was roaring in pain and rage. Mordain stood before him with a ritual blade cutting his own palm to begin the blood magic. Ilara screamed and charged forward, but dark elf warriors appeared blocking her path. These were the corrupted allies that Mordain had made deals with, and their presence proved his betrayal. The crowd gasped, seeing dark elves in the sacred throne room. Jake fought beside Ilara as they tried to reach Emberfang, but there were too many enemies. Mordain was completing the ritual, and silver chains of magic began to wrap around the dragon mind. Emberfang's mental voice cried out in agony as the forced bond began to take hold. Then Jake remembered something from his transformation, and he reached out with his mind to Emberfang. The dragon bond they shared was still new, but it was real, and Jake poured his will into strengthening it. He told Emberfang to fight and resist the dark magic. Ilara felt what Jake was doing and joined her own will to theirs, creating a triangle of mental strength. The three of them together pushed back against Mordain ritual, and the silver chains began to crack and break. The prince screamed in fury, realizing his plan was failing. King Theron stood before the crowd and declared Mordain a traitor, pointing at the dark elves as proof. Kate fighters appeared outside the palace windows, having won their battle, and the people could see the truth. Mordain had allied with enemies of the Confederation. Mordain realized he was losing and drew his sword, challenging Jake to single combat. He invoked the ancient law of trial by combat, where the winner would claim the throne. Jake wanted to refuse, but knew this was the only way to end things without civil war. Ilara tried to stop him, saying Mordain had centuries of combat training, but Jake touched her face gently. He said that sometimes humans won not because they were stronger, but because they refused to give up. She kissed him then in front of everyone. The combat began, and Mordain moved with the speed and skill of an ancient warrior. His blade was a blur, and Jake barely blocked the strikes. Blood ran down his arms from cuts, and he knew he could not match Mordain's technique. But Jake had something Mordain did not have, which was the fire inside him from the dragon bond. He let his blood ignite, creating flames that ran along his skin. The silver veins glowed bright, and Jake moved faster than he ever had before. Mordain was shocked by the transformation, and his next strike missed. Jake pressed the advantage, using unconventional moves that no elf would expect. He fought dirty and desperate, like a human facing impossible odds. The turning point came when Jake deliberately let Mordain's blade cut his chest deep. Blood poured out, but Jake grabbed Mordain's wrist and ignited his own blood. The flash of fire blinded Mordain for a crucial second. In that moment, Ilara shattered the chains, holding Emberfang, and the dragon roared. The sound shook the entire palace, and dragon fire poured out, destroying the dark elf warriors who tried to intervene. Mordain stumbled back in fear. Jake stood over him with his stolen sword at Mordain's throat, and the crowd fell silent. Everyone expected Jake to kill the traitor, but he looked at Ilara and King Theron. He said that execution would make them no better than Mordain and would only create more division. King Theron agreed and declared Mordain exiled forever from the Confederation. The prince was stripped of all titles and rank and led away in chains. His dark elf allies were either captured or fled, and the coup was over. The throne room erupted in cheers as the king reclaimed his throne. Ilara ran to Jake and caught him as he collapsed from blood loss. Healers rushed forward, but Jake was conscious enough to smile. He told her they won, and she laughed through tears. Emberfang landed beside them, and his voice rumbled in their minds, saying that the human was too stubborn to die properly. Kate appeared with her squadron reporting complete victory and minimal casualties. The capital was secure. Jake was taken to the medical bay again, and healers worked for hours to repair the damage. The dragon fire in his blood helped him heal faster than normal, but he would carry scars forever. Ilara stayed with him the whole time, refusing to leave. When Jake finally woke, King Theron was there, and the king smiled warmly. He said that Jake had proven himself worthy 100 times over, and the kingdom was forever in his debt. More importantly, Jake had shown what true partnership meant. The king declared that the wedding would take place in 1 week, and this time it would be a true wedding based on love and choice. Alara took Jake's hand and said she was ready if he was. Jake looked at her and Emberfang and knew his answer. The week before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and celebration, and Jake still could not believe this was his life now. The palace buzzed with activity as servants decorated everything with flowers that glowed softly and banners that shimmered like starlight. Kate helped Jake prepare, and she teased him about being nervous. He admitted he was more scared of the wedding than he had been of the battle. Kate laughed and said that was perfectly normal. She would serve as his best woman and promised to make sure he did not pass out. Ilara was busy with her own preparations, and Jake only saw her briefly each day. Each time she looked more beautiful and more happy, and Jake felt his heart swell. Emberfang commented dryly that the humans were being overly emotional, but Jake could sense the dragon was pleased. The ceremony would combine human and elven traditions, creating something new and unique. King Theron had invited representatives from Earth, including Jake, former captain, and several admirals. The humans arrived with gifts and congratulations, clearly happy to see the alliance strengthened. On the morning of the wedding, Jake stood in his quarters, staring at himself in the mirror. He wore a uniform that blended Earth military style with elven design, and the result looked good. The silver veins under his skin still glowed faintly, reminding him of everything that had happened. Kate knocked and entered, carrying a small box that she said was a gift from the king. Inside was a ring made of dragon scale and starlight metal that would never tarnish or break. She helped Jake put it on and told him he was ready. The ceremony took place in the Great Hall, which was filled with thousands of guests from dozens of worlds. Jake walked down the aisle with Kate beside him and saw familiar faces smiling at him. The entire human delegation stood proudly representing Earth. King Theron sat on his throne looking regal and happy, and beside him was a smaller throne for Ilara. Emberfang lay in his usual place, but today the dragon wore decorations of gold and silver. His eyes watched Jake with what might have been approval. Then the music changed, and Ilara appeared at the far end of the hall. She wore a dress that seemed made of moonlight itself, and her silver hair flowed free. She walked slowly toward Jake, and he forgot how to breathe. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. When she reached him, Ilara took his hands, and they stood together before her father. King Theron spoke about the joining of two souls and two peoples, and how love could bridge any distance. His words were simple but powerful, and Jake felt tears in his eyes. The ceremony included human vows where Jake promised to love and protect Ilara through all the years to come. She made the same promises, and her voice was steady and strong. Then came the elven bonding ritual where they exchanged blood and fire, symbolizing eternal connection. Emberfang's role was to witness and bless the union, and the dragon rose to his full height. His voice spoke in everyone's minds, declaring that he approved of this bond and would protect both of them. The dragon fire that surrounded them was warm and gentle. When the ceremony ended, Jake and Ilara kissed and the hall erupted in cheers. Kate was crying openly, and even some of the elven nobles looked moved. King Theron declared them married and named Jake as Prince Consort of the Elven Confederation. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, with feasts and dancing and music. Representatives from across the galaxy came to offer congratulations and gifts. The Shadow Swarm had retreated after their alliance with the Dark Elves was exposed, and peace seemed possible. On the third night, Jake and Ilara slipped away from the party and found Emberfang waiting on a balcony. The dragon suggested they go flying, and Jake agreed immediately. They climbed onto Emberfang back and launched into the sky. The twin suns of Silverhaven were setting, and the sky was painted in colors Jake had no names for. They flew higher and higher until the palace looked like a tiny jewel below. Emberfang spread his wings and glided, letting them enjoy the silence. Jake held Ilara close and asked if she was happy, and she said yes, without hesitation. She told him that for 300 years, she had believed she would always be alone fighting an endless war. Meeting him had changed everything and given her hope. Jake admitted that he came to an alien wedding expecting disaster and instead found a home. He had gained a wife who was a warrior princess and a dragon companion who was sarcastic but loyal. More importantly, he had found a purpose beyond just surviving. Emberfang's voice rumbled in their minds, saying they were both being too sentimental, but the dragon tone was fond. He said that humans were good at making dramatic speeches, and elves were good at being overly serious. Together they balanced each other. They flew for hours talking about the future and making plans. The Shadow Swarm was still out there and would need to be fought, but now they had allies and strategy. Jake ideas combined with elven magic and dragon fire might finally turn the tide. Elara talked about building a new order of keepers that included humans and other species. The old ways of isolation had not worked, and it was time for the Confederation to embrace change. King Theron supported this vision and wanted Jake to help lead it. Kate had agreed to stay and train more human pilots in the new tactics that had proven effective. Earth was sending more representatives and resources, and the alliance between humans and elves was growing stronger every day. Jake felt proud of what they had accomplished. As the night deepened, Emberfang flew toward the crystal moon, where Jake and Elara would spend their first days as a married couple. The palace there was smaller and more private, perfect for them to be alone together. They landed on a balcony overlooking endless fields of crystal flowers that chimed in the wind. Emberfang settled down nearby, promising to stand guard but giving them privacy. Jake and Elara walked through the flowers hand in hand. She told him a secret that the elven people believed the crystal flowers only bloomed for true love. They had not bloomed in decades, but tonight they were glowing brighter than ever. Jake laughed and said maybe fate had been planning this all along. They sat together watching the stars, and Jake thought about how far he had come. A few months ago, he was just a captain trying to survive. And now he was a prince, married to an amazing woman with a dragon as family. Elara leaned against him and said that she was grateful he had drunk from the wrong cup. Without that mistake, they never would have met and she would still be alone. Jake kissed her and said it was the best mistake he ever made. Emberfang's voice echoed softly in their minds, saying humans were so dramatic, but also admitting he was glad things turned out this way. The dragon had gained not one but 2 partners, and that was more than he expected. The future was uncertain with wars to fight and challenges to face, but Jake felt ready. He had Elara and Emberfang beside him, and together they could handle anything. The crystal flowers chimed around them like bells celebrating their union. As dawn approached, Jake and Elara returned to their chambers, but they stood on the balcony watching the suns rise together. The light painted the sky in gold and pink and purple, and Jake felt a peace he had not known in years. He had come to an alien wedding as a confused human captain, and somehow become a prince, and warrior, and dragon rider. His life had transformed completely, and he would not change a single moment. This was where he belonged. Elara whispered that she loved him, and Jake said it back, meaning every word. They had been brought together by accident, but stayed together by choice, that made their bond even stronger than destiny. Emberfang launched into the sky roaring flames that lit up the dawn, and Jake and Elara watched their dragon friend soar. The war was not over, and peace would take work, but they would face it all together as partners and family. The crystal flowers continued to chime, and Jake smiled, knowing that no matter what came next, he was finally home.